All right. So I think we are good to go. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this session on assumption. Now, let's get started with what an assumption is. An assumption is an implicit, that means unstated, it's not explicitly stated premise. And we know that a premise is basically a supporting statement, right? So, another way of saying the same thing is to say that an assumption is a support statement that the argument takes for granted. Here's a quick example. Have a look at this one. Tell me what you think the assumption is, or the big assumption, the one that stands out. Right. So Karthik is saying Jaspreet is a woman. That's right. So women become great managers over time. Jaspreet is a woman. Therefore, Jaspreet will be a great manager one day. Now, it's much, much easier to draw this conclusion from the support that has been given to us. So, the author of the argument says that, women become great managers over time, but the conclusion is about Jaspreet. So, we're missing something there, right? A connection between Jaspreet and being a woman. So, we supply that, and that gives us an assumption over here. Now, let's talk about some properties of assumptions. First of all assumptions are basically strengthen options, or at least it's a subset of strengthen. So think about it this way: an assumption is something that the author hasn't explicitly stated, right? But it's a premise, and a premise is a support statement. So all assumptions are basically going to end up supporting the argument, they end up strengthening the argument. And I see that Vansh has joined us. Good morning, Vansh. You can enable your microphone by clicking the button on the top left of your screen. All right, so let's get back to this. So, assumptions are basically going to be a subset of strengthen. So, think of them as a special type of strengthen. Now, an interesting thing about assumptions is that there are always infinitely many assumptions for any situation. So, sometimes an assumption option or the correct answer to an assumption question will fall into a particular pattern, and we'll discuss some of these patterns. But for many of these situations, what you're going to find is that the GMAT can be very imaginative when it comes to the correct answer, right? So there are always, for any situation, there are always infinitely many assumptions. Now, within assumptions, you can get two types of assumptions. So we have sufficient assumptions. Sufficient assumptions help us draw the conclusion from the support. Now, over here, typically what we're going to find is there is a gap in the argument, and this is something that we'll refer to as a missing link. So there's a gap, and a sufficient assumption will help us address that gap. Now, typically, what you'll see in your question stems is something like, the argument can be drawn if which of the following is assumed, or the argument follows logically if which of the following is assumed. That'll be a sufficient assumption. Now, we'll talk about what sufficient assumptions are, but there are certain indicators in stems that can help us see whether we're looking at a sufficient assumption or not. Now, the thing about sufficient assumptions is they are kind of predictable. If you can see the gap in the logic of an argument, that does make it easier for you to predict what the answer will be. So, if the answer is based on this sufficient assumption, then it may be very easy for you to spot it. Now, what are necessary assumptions? Necessary assumptions are things that must be true for the conclusion to be true. Now, many times with necessary assumptions, what you're going to find is there is no clear connection with the support, and that makes them kind of unpredictable. But how would you recognize a necessary assumption, or that the question is asking you for a necessary assumption? Typically, what you'll find is in the stem, you're going to find something like the conclusion depends on, or something is necessary, or relies on, or requires, right? The conclusion requires which of the following. So, some of these indicators in your STEM will help you understand that you're looking at a question that's asking you for a necessary assumption. And as we just discussed, necessary assumptions, the GMAT can just absolutely go wild with their imagination over here. They can come up with anything, right? So it's very, very hard to predict the correct answer to a necessary assumption because the options available to the GMAT are basically limitless. All right. Now, let's take an example of a sufficient assumption. So, let's say that we tweak our example a little bit, the one that we just saw. So, the one that says Jaspreet is a woman. Let's say that we start with the statement Jaspreet is a woman, right? And then we say Jaspreet will become a great manager one day. Now, what can we put in as an assumption over here? And remember, we want to keep it as similar to the previous example that we looked at as possible. Feel free to unmute and give me your thoughts on this.
That women become great managers of the sentence.
Right. So when you say women become great managers, can I modify that slightly and write down all women become great managers?
Yes, I think that makes more sense.
No, no, that's not what I meant. Your statement is fine. I'm just saying what you said, right? Women become great managers. That is another way of saying all women become great managers, right?
Correct.
Excellent. Now, this is an assumption, but what you'll find is this is a very, very uh, broad assumption. A slightly narrower assumption would have been something like women named Jasprit become great managers over time. But even that would not have been absolutely necessary, depending on how specific we want to get. Just let me have a quick check with you guys, right? We're talking about all women, right? But the argument is only about Jasprit. So this argument does not really need us to talk about all women, but this statement is talking about all women, right? Just a quick check. Is everyone agreed that this statement is a little broad? Let me have a quick yes in the chat window. Okay, I've received a few yeses on this. Perfect. So that's what a sufficient assumption is like. A sufficient assumption can be quite broad, right? It can go way beyond what we need. It does help us get to the conclusion, so it does fix a particular gap in the argument, but it can be very, very broad. And what you're going to find with these sufficient assumptions is that you're going to find some very, very strong words in the correct option. Words like all or none, everyone. So, everyone, all, none, these are very strong words, and you'll typically find those in sufficient assumption options. Now, let's turn to an example for a necessary assumption. Yeah, let's go back to our Jasprit example. Um, what about so we're saying that women become great managers over time. Jasprit is a woman, therefore Jasprit will become a great manager one day. What about an option like Jasprit won't die before becoming a great manager? What do you guys think about that? Is that necessary? Let me have a yes or a no. Okay, I've got a few yeses on this. Great. Yes, that's a necessary assumption. Now, what I want you to appreciate about this necessary assumption is it had basically nothing to do with the information that we were given in the argument, right? It just came out of nowhere and was very, very unpredictable. So it was a little strange to see something like this associated with the information that we have, but it is necessary, right? Now, this necessary bit also leads us to the next point. The correct option will respond to this so called negation test. Now, let me have a quick idea from you guys. Have you guys heard about this negation test? Let me have a yes or a no in the chat window. Oh, I'm getting a lot of yeses. Yes, I've heard, but would be great if you could do a quick recap of it. Absolutely, Shreya. I'm not sure about the quick part. I'll definitely do a recap, but I'm not sure if it's going to be quick or not. Let's do that. So let's start with what you guys know about negation. Please unmute and give me an idea about what you have heard or what you've read about negation.
So, Ajitesh, am I audible?
Absolutely. Please go ahead, Karthik.
So I'll give you my understanding with the example you just mentioned. That
Hmm.
if Jasprit will not die before she becomes a manager. Now, if
Hmm.
I negate this, if Jasprit dies before she becomes the manager, then the whole argument falls apart that she will one day become a great manager. So this is how the negation test works.
Got it. So you've put it very well. Let me ask a specific question about what you expect will happen to the conclusion once you negate the correct option. When you
It
say
will.
the conclusion will, sorry, go ahead.
Yes, yes, please.
I was just asking, when you say the conclusion will fall apart, do you want the conclusion to be, like completely gone, like demolished?
Yes, that is what I understand.
Fair enough. And that is the common definition of negation that we see. So Typically, what people say is that if you negate the correct option, it'll cause the conclusion to fail, right? The conclusion will just not be possible anymore. Now, that is a workable way to look at negation, but just for the sake of practicality, given what I've seen in GMAT questions, I actually ask my students to use a slightly modified version of this. So in our classes, what we typically do is we say if you negate the correct option, that'll either cause the conclusion to fail or it'll severely weaken the conclusion. So we keep both possibilities in mind. In some cases, what you're going to find is it's not going to completely make the conclusion impossible, but it will at least severely weaken it. Now, this is just my recommendation. You're welcome to go with whichever definition of, whichever way of looking at negation that you're comfortable with. But let me just get a quick check. Let me have a yes. If you're comfortable with the different ways in which we want you to look at negation, remember, you can choose whichever one you want. Just let me have a yes if you're comfortable with what we've said here. So I've got multiple yeses on this. Excellent. Now let's do that quick, hopefully, recap of negation. Now, if you get a very straightforward statement, right, and this is the majority of cases, what you can just do is you can just stick a not over there. So we would just simply call this not negation. Now, there's a statement in front of you. The number of companies has increased. Now, given that this is English, right, everything that's given to us is in English, it's very, very tempting to say that the opposite, right, the negation of this statement would be the number of companies has decreased. Now, let me tell you straight away that this statement is not the correct negation of the given statement. Can anyone tell me why? Why is this wrong?
Yeah, because if the company has not increased, it does not necessarily mean it has decreased. It can also remain stable.
Perfect. Kush, does that match up with your point as well?
Yes.
Awesome. And Shohini, were you thinking along the same lines?
Yes, Ajitesh.
Perfect. So if the number of companies has increased, there are multiple other possibilities, right? It could have decreased, but it could have remained the same as well. What we want is something, a statement that is mutually exclusive, but covers the entire range of possibilities collectively. So the number of companies has decreased doesn't do that. It doesn't cover all the possibilities along with the first statement. It leaves one possibility open, and that is the number of companies has remained the same. Right? It's a constant. So the correct negation would be the number of companies has not increased, because not increased includes both possibilities, decreased or remained the same. Quick check. Let me have a yes if everyone's comfortable with this. All right. I've received multiple yeses on this. Now, let me give you another example. And what you're going to see with this example is we're now going to introduce a subordinate clause. Now, those of you who've done sentence correction, you may have come across this term before, but otherwise don't worry about it. Basically, you'll get something that starts with maybe an if or maybe, like a when or a while. The part within that, right? What we want to basically do is we don't want to negate that part. We want to focus on the main statement, not something that has been attached to the main statement. It's easier to see with an example. If it rains, I carry an umbrella. Now, what you see over here is that you've got something on the left hand side, which is within an if, and you've got something on the right hand side, which is just on its own. Now, sometimes people think that negation means that you go ahead and negate everything within the statement. So maybe it would end up looking something like this. They would say the negation would end up telling us that if it does not rain, I don't carry an umbrella. So they'll negate both sides of the statement. This is a mistake. So the negation of if it rains, I carry an umbrella is simply if it rains, I don't carry an umbrella. That's the negation. Quick check. Is everyone comfortable with this? Let me have a yes or a no. Okay, multiple yeses. Perfect. Now, what you might have noticed is we're making our statement slightly more complicated. And one way to make a statement more complicated is to introduce some sort of quantifier into the picture. Over here, what you see is if there are modifiers or numbers, focus on those modifiers or numbers and negate them. Don't go for the main verb. Right? Remember, when we said that we had a simple statement, so when we had a simple statement, we just went straight for the main verb and we just put a not over there, right? But when you have these modifiers, you need to be careful. You don't typically go for the main verb, right? There are some exceptions, but you typically don't go for the main verb. You instead focus on the quantifiers. Let's take another statement. All members of the audience were men. Now, when you're ready, I'd like you to give me the negation of this.
So, Ajitesh, not all members of the audience were men.
Very good. Now, I see that Shreya is typing. Shreya, please unmute. Let us know. Is this what you were thinking?
Yeah. Yes.
Very good. Now, let me ask you guys about this statement. All members of the audience were women. Can I say that? I mean, when I say, can I say that? What I mean is, can I say that the second statement is the negation, is the logical negation of the first statement? Okay, Kush is saying no. Kush, can you tell me why? Why do you think this is not the negation?
So it might be a possibility that only subset of the members of audience were men. I mean, even that logically negates the statement one, right?
So Kush is obviously onto something over here, right? Let's not forget that. But there's something very specific about the second statement that I want to discuss. So we'll come back to Kush's point in just a second. But anything else in the second statement that we feel is just, that's strange?
It feels like it's the statements are saying that they're both mutually exclusive, right? So you either have men or women, which may not be the case. You may actually have both men and women.
Now you've said two things over there, right? And the first part is absolutely on the right track. So basically, if we say that the second is the negation of the first, what we're basically saying is there is an either or situation between men and women, and together they are the whole picture, right? Now, this is natural. I mean, in natural language or English, it's very common to say, okay, a woman is the opposite of man, or man is the opposite of woman, right? But let's think about what these words actually mean. What is a man? It's a man. A man is an adult male, right? And a woman is an adult female. So if we say all members of the audience were men, and the negation of that is all members of the audience were women, at some point, are we assuming that the members of the audience were only adults? Quick check. Let me have a yes or a no. Right. Excellent. So if we say something like all members of the audience were women, what's basically happening is we are not accounting for the possibility of, I mean, at a very simple level, just one example, children, right? Boys and girls. So that's a problem with this negation, right? And now we come back to the points that you guys raised, which is we must account for other possibilities. So the very first answer we got was the opposite, or the logical negation of all members of the audience were men is not all members of the audience were men. Think about it this way. All means 100%, right? So all members of the audience were men means 100% of the members of the audience were men. And the opposite of that is something other than 100%. Right? That's all. So not all. Awesome. Quick check. Is everyone comfortable with this? Not all members of the audience were men is the logical negation of all members of the audience were men. Let me have a yes if you're comfortable with this. Okay, I've received a few yeses on this. Perfect. Now for one more example. Now this one is going to come.
Ajitesh.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, so I was just thinking it on the lines when you said no, if there are no numbers or modifiers, we can negate the main verb. So even if can one approach this statement like this, that all members of the audience were not men. So will it mean the same as not all members of the audience were men? So I've again negated the main verb in a way.
So what you've done is you've not negated the main verb, you've negated the word men.
Okay.
So just to quickly point out what he's saying, can we say the negation of this statement is all members of the audience were not men, right? So you've kind of attached the word not to men, right? Is that correct?
Yes.
Right. Okay. Tell me what you guys think about this. All members of the audience were not men. And it's going to be very interesting to hear your opinions on this because this statement can possibly be interpreted in two ways.
I feel that when we say all members of the audience were not men, that sort of says that 100% of the audience were not men. So, like 100% of the audience was something else.
Yes. So that's the other way to interpret this sentence. So one way to interpret this statement would be the way, Karthik went about it. All members of the audience were not men, right? So what he's trying to say is not all members of the audience were men. His initial statement. But if you look at the statement, someone reading it might misinterpret it as all members of the audience were not men. That is, there is a category, not men, right? Something other than men, which is not the correct negation. Because you want to, as Kush pointed out, you want to have the possibility of some men in the picture. Quick check. Karthik, is that okay?
Yes, it is.
Perfect. Now, let's go back to our final example. And this one is entirely going to be open to you guys. Let me know when you have the negation of that final statement that you see over there, the one about scoring a century. Let me know when you're ready. Unmute and give me your answer.
Hi, Ajitesh.
Go ahead.
It will be none of the members of the team have not scored a century, or every member of the team have scored a century. Every member
Excellent.
of the team, yeah.
Yes, that is absolutely correct. But let me first ask you guys, why can't I just negate the main verb? Now remember, the current verb has the adverb not, right? So why can't I just take that not away and just say, some members of the team have scored a century? Is the logical negation of some members of the team have not scored a century. Why can't I say that?
So that keeps the possibility of original statement, right? I mean, when you say some members of the team have scored a century, that also means that there exists a member who have not scored a century, right? So
Very
not
good. Kush, is it correct to say that what you're saying is these two statements are not mutually exclusive?
yes.
That is correct. So when you read the first one, right, some members of the team have not scored a century, and you look at the second statement, some members of the team have scored a century, you should ask yourself, are these two statements compatible? That is, given the first statement, is the second statement also possible at the same time? Take your time, think about it. If the first statement is true, can the second statement simultaneously be true? When you're ready, let me have a yes or a no. Okay, I've got multiple yeses on this very quickly. Yeah, that is absolutely correct. So these statements are not cleanly dividing the set that we're dealing with. They're actually not incompatible. They are compatible. That's not the correct negation. Now let's turn to the statement that Shohini gave us, which is what she said is none. We can instead say no members of the team have not scored a century. Now, to understand why this is the correct negation, let's look at the first one again. Some members of the team have not scored a century. Now, over here, it really helps to know that in logic, the word some means something greater than zero up to and including all. A lot of times people think some means like few, and that's exactly how it works in English, right? In natural English. But in logic, when you say some, what you mean is anything that is not zero. So anything more than zero. So anything more than zero includes the possibility of all, right? So when you say some members of the team have not scored a century, and the word some means anything more than zero up to and including all, the opposite of that must be zero. And a word for zero is none or no. And therefore, the negation of the statement, some members have not scored a century, is no members have not scored a century. Quick check. First, let me have a yes on this. Does this sound reasonably okay? Okay, multiple yeses on this. Perfect. Now, another way to say the same thing is like this. All members of the team have scored a century, right? So that is an equivalent statement. And it's okay. You can come up with either of these statements, and that's perfectly fine, right? The way you word it doesn't matter that much. What matters is that it is, in fact, the logical negation of the statement. Quick check, is everyone comfortable with the examples that we've taken before we do a quick wrap up on negation?
I have one question. Does do these quantifiers take precedence over the main verb if they are present?
Yes. I want you guys to look at it logically, right? But if you're in a hurry and you're just looking at an option that has a quantifier, then yes, the first place you should look is the quantifier. Quick check, Shashank, is that okay?
Yeah.
Perfect. Karthik, I feel that you had also,
Yes.
if I remember correctly, you had unmuted. Please go ahead.
Yes. So, Ajitesh, what I understand now is sum is a number which is greater than 0 but less than 1. So, it includes all possibilities between 0 and 1. And now the extremities, none and all, are the negations of this word sum, right?
So all is not the negation of some, because all is included in some. So let me help you visualize it like this. First of all, we are dealing with non-negative quantities, right?
Yes.
Let's say we start at 0 and all is represented as 100. Okay. Now, when you say sum in English, right, you could literally mean anything greater than 0, that is. But in English, it typically means like a small number. Like out of 100, when you say sum, I mean, what comes to your mind? I don't know, maybe 5, 6, 10. It's not defined, right? So when we look at sum in logic, what we're basically saying is, what can we say for sure about the word sum? As soon as you say sum, right, what that basically means is it cannot be 0. That is, it's some non-zero quantity. So it's on the right-hand side of 0. It does not include 0, but it may include all. I'm not saying it includes all, but it may include all when you say some. More importantly, the possibility of all is open. So effectively, you are looking at this area with some. So anything more than 0 up to and including all. So the opposite of that is something that lies outside this. Remember, it has to be mutually exclusive. The only possibility left is 0 itself, which is none. And that is why we say that all is not the negation of some. The negation of some is none or no. Quick check, Karthik, is that better?
Yes, so Ajitesh, now my follow up is this, that is the second statement, all members of the team have scored a century, is a weaker negation of the statement compared to the no members of the team.
So when you say weaker, what do you have in mind?
I mean to say that because some includes the possibility that all members of the team might have scored a century, the second statement, the second negation, all members of the team have scored a century, it essentially, the first statement can still mean that all members of the team have scored a century. So how can it be a negation? You getting what I'm saying?
Just give me a second. Oh, my apologies. I made a mistake when I was writing this statement. The actual example is this: some members of the team have not scored a century. Oh, hang on. What am I looking at? Sorry, my apologies. So, by mistake, what I did is I looked at the incorrect negation, the one in red. What I was trying to look at is the initial statement, the one we are trying to negate.
Okay.
So, Karthik, let me check. When you ask whether this is a weaker negation or a different negation, are you looking at statement 1 or statement 2?
I was looking at statement 2. My apologies.
I I totally get that, because when you ask that question, I did the same thing. So it's totally natural. But when we go
Okay.
back to the first statement, some members have not scored a century. That means the number that have not scored a century, that number is not 0. It is something other than 0. So the opposite of that will be that number is 0. 0 have not scored a century. That means everyone has scored a century.
Right. Okay.
Right?
Fine.
Excellent. Now let's head into a quick final look at negation. With negation, what we basically find sometimes is just logical opposites, right? And these logical opposites are so common, you can just memorize them if you want. One quick example would be sum, right? We put some effort into discussing this and understanding why the opposite of sum is none, right? And similarly, the opposite of none is sum. So I think this is something we understand. And the opposite of all is not all, right? And later on, if you guys revisit the example that we took, you will find that another way of phrasing not all is some followed by a not. So you use some and then you put a not. That's another possibility. So it's actually, I think, a good idea to just memorize these. They can be used quite often. Now, keep in mind that some means more than 0, but the possibility of all is open, right? Few, now, these are not that useful on your GMAT critical reasoning, but let's discuss them. Few means 2 or more. Several means more than 2. And finally, a word like many is just not well defined. It totally depends on your context. Now, keeping this in mind, let's talk about when we use negation. Now, the common advice is to use negation, let's say, when you're down to a couple of options, right? So you've removed maybe 2 or 3 options that were easy to remove, and you're struggling to choose between 2 options. That's when you use negation. And that's my recommendation as well. I'm going to quickly ask you guys whether you agree with that. Let me know. Is this how you use negation, or do you use negation more as a, like your primary entry point into an assumption question?
So, Ajitesh, I had one doubt.
Mhm.
So, I have heard that the most means more than 50%. Is that correct or not?
That sounds correct, yes. Most would mean like a majority. That sounds correct, yes. But is there a reason that you have a doubt about that?
So, I mean, sometimes options do have like similar, like here you have defined many, right? That many is not well defined. So, sometimes options have
Mhm.
something like most. So, just wanted to clarify how we interpret that.
Right. I think your interpretation is absolutely fine. If you find that it creates a problem in some option, let me know and we'll take a look at that. But
Okay,
just
thank
going
you.
by what you've said, it sounds fine.
Okay.
Awesome. Okay, now let me know, guys. How do you use it? I mean, personally speaking, I typically don't use negation, but let me know, what do you guys think? Do you use negation for like all the options, or do you use it like only if you have to? It has never worked for me in harder questions. Okay. Shohini went stuck with the closest 2 options. All right. Shreya saying, oh, the same as Karthik. Okay. Try to use it for the relevant options only after elimination. Yeah, I think that makes sense. So maybe if you're stuck with 2 options, or you just want to like double check your final decisions. You think you've got the right answer, but you just want to check, okay, does it respond to the negation test or not? So let's quickly wrap up on this. Negation is firstly a time consuming technique, right? If you negate this, you open yourself up to the possibility that you could make a mistake with the negation, right? That's one possibility. The other possibility is doing all this takes time, especially if you've got multiple options that you're going to negate. So I think keeping that in mind, let's remember that negation is more of a fallback technique, right? It's not typically advisable to take this as the main entry point into an assumption question. Also, keep in mind that negation is useful for pretty much only the necessary assumptions, right? And there's a reason for this. Negation is not magic, right? Negation is just taking something called the contrapositive. It's applicable in necessary assumptions. We typically do not apply negation to sufficient assumptions. But anyway, that's the recap of negation. Quick check, Shreya, was it a good recap? Was it like a quick recap? I'm not sure. Let me know. Okay, fair enough. Now, let's carry on. The first category, right, is missing link. Missing link is something that you typically remember see with sufficient assumption. It's not super common with necessary assumption, but this is very, very common with sufficient assumption. The general form is very simple. If somebody says A is equal to B, and on the basis of the statement that A is equal to B, somebody says A is equal to C, like what's the assumption that just jumps out? Yeah, as Karthik is saying B is equal to Shreya is also saying B is equal to C, right? And Kush is also confirming B is equal to C. That just immediately jumps out. So if you can see the logic of the argument, right, and this gap is over there, if you can fill in the gap, that's going to be a possible answer, right? So if the question is built around this particular pattern, it may actually be very, very easy for you to spot that. But we're going to take an example of this. Now, as always, I'll give you guys 2 minutes to solve the question, half a minute to find the question, 2 minutes to solve it. So a total of 2.5 minutes. Please go ahead. Okay, so that's time. Please check your answers. The correct answer is D. D for Delta. Firstly, quick check. Are we comfortable with this one? D? We'll discuss the question, but first let me know if you're comfortable with the correct option over here. Okay, I've received a few yeses on this. Perfect. Now let's summarize the stimulus, right? So the argument that we've got goes like this. Many cabinet makers have been winning acclaim as artists. Okay. Since furniture must be useful, cabinet makers must exercise their craft with an eye to the practical utility of their product. So we've got an inference over here, but we should keep on reading. For this reason, cabinet making is not art. This is another inference. So let's put these statements down. Furniture must be useful. Cabinet makers must exercise their craft. Exercising their craft is basically another way of saying, cabinet making. So cabinet making must be done with practical utility in mind. Now, when the author says for this reason, cabinet making is not art, right? That's our conclusion. So cabinet making is not art. Why? Because cabinet making must be done with practical utility of the product in mind. Now, this furniture must be useful. We'll call that an indirect support, right? So furniture must be useful. That's the first statement, which helps us get to the second statement. And the second statement helps us get to the third statement. Quick check. Is everyone comfortable visualizing the argument like this? So if you look at the structure of the argument, that's pretty much what we've been given. Okay, I've got a couple of yeses on this. Let me just quick check. Any doubts? Shashank's also confirmed. One, Shohini, and I think Shreya. Vansh, is this okay? Excellent. All right, now let's take a look at the question stem. Which of the following is an assumption that supports drawing the conclusion above from the reason given for that statement? Over here, the first thing you'll notice is in no way are they implying that the correct answer needs to be, absolutely necessary or required. They're not saying that, only if this thing is assumed can we get to the conclusion. They're not saying any of that. They're just saying which of the following is an assumption that supports drawing the conclusion above. So from this statement, you will be able to get to this statement, right? That's basically what they're asking. Let's take a look at our options. Some furniture is made to be placed in museums where it will not be used by anyone. When we see an option like this, right, why does the author need to care about whether furniture is made to be placed in museums or not? It seems to have absolutely nothing to do with the logic of the argument, which is about practical utility, right? So whether there is a link between practical utility and museums, it's extremely unclear. So this kind of an option is not something that the author is even considering. If you take a look at B, some cabinet makers are more concerned than others with the practical utility of the products they produce. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to use this option to practice negation. Now, remember, we're not actually trying to negate this option to solve the question, right? We're not doing that. We're just doing negation for the sake of practice. That's it. So have a look at option B and tell me, when you're ready, what is the logical negation of the second statement? Or the second option, sorry.
So Ajitesh, here, if I use the negation with the modifiers or the quantifier, it won't make sense, because if I say all cabinet makers are more concerned than others, then who are the others if they are not included in all? The similar issue will.
So remember, the negation of some is not all. The negation of some is no or none.
Right. So, okay. So, if I may put it this way, so no cabinet makers are more concerned than others. Still, it does not make sense, right? Because whom are we comparing it with?
No problem, no problem. We can approach this another way. If you look at the statement, right? So remember, you don't have to approach this mechanically. You can approach this by thinking about it. If you say some cabinet makers are more concerned than others with the practical utility of the products they produce, isn't that a way of saying that there exists some, let's call it differential, in the concern levels of the cabinet makers?
Yes.
Right? So if some cabinet makers are more concerned, that will mean that some are less, some are more, right? There is a difference.
Yes.
The opposite of that is to assert that there is no difference,
Right.
that the difference does not exist. So the negation could be all cabinet makers are equally concerned.
Yes. This is how I
Right?
was trying to approach it. Yes. Correct. Okay.
Perfect. And now let's wrap up with your initial statement, which was actually correct. No cabinet makers are more concerned. That means the number of cabinet makers that is more concerned is 0. And that can happen when? When all are equally concerned.
Yes.
Right? Excellent. All right, now let's take a look at the third option. Cabinet makers should be more concerned with the practical utility of the products than they currently are. Again, this is not something that the author is missing, right? Whether they should be even more concerned. Now, who cares about whether they should be more concerned or not, right? But if you take a look at option D, an object is not an art object if its maker pays attention to the object's practical utility. Now, first of all, let's be clear. This statement is very broad, right? It's basically like saying that if practical utility, then not art. It's broad, but does it help us get to the conclusion? That's the question we want to ask ourselves. So in this sort of a situation, we're not asking ourselves, hey, look, is this statement necessary? But does it help us get to the conclusion? Does it plug one of those gaps? Does it supply us a missing link? Quick check. Does it look kind of like it can slot into the middle of our argument between the conclusion and the support? Okay, I've received multiple yeses on this. Awesome. And once, just a quick confirmation. So let's just take a look at what the argument looks like. If I remember correctly, what they said is cabinet making is done with practical utility in mind. Therefore, cabinet making is not art. And what option D does is it says if you pay attention to the practical utility, it's not art. So, cabinet making is done with practical utility in mind. Things that are done with practical utility in mind are not art, and therefore, cabinet making is not art. Quick check. Watch. Does this look good? Perfect. Now, let's take a look at the last one. Artists are not concerned with the monetary value of their product. Again, the logic of this argument really doesn't have anything to do with, what the monetary value is, or, what artists are concerned with. So it's very hard to see how this would link to the argument or the conclusion in any way. Awesome. Now, before we move on to the next question, quick check. Any questions, any doubts regarding this question? Let me have a yes or a no. No if you don't have any doubts, and a yes, or unmute if you have doubts. Okay, nice. I think almost everyone's confirmed. Karthik, just quick check. We're good to move on to the next one, right? Perfect. All right, here's your next question. As always, 2.5 minutes. All right, that's time. Please check your answers. The correct answer in this question, if I remember, is D for Delta. Now, I'd like one of you to, okay, Vansh is confirming. I'd like one of you guys to walk me through this one. Whenever you're ready, please unmute and let me know.
Yeah, hi Ajitesh. So, do I explain the correct answer?
I think it would be really helpful if you can walk us through the entire thing. So, what you see in the
Okay.
argument, right? And then why the correct answer is correct. From my side, I have one option that I'd like you guys to tell me specifically, like why it's wrong. If I remember correctly, that's C.
Hmm. So basically, it starts with parapsychology is often considered as pseudoscience. So parapsychology is equated to pseudoscience. And then it is saying that it is in fact a genuine scientific enterprise because parapsychology uses scientific methods such as control experiments and statistical tests. So here the parapsychology has been equated to a general science. So basically, here parapsychology is pseudoscience, and there is something parapsychology is equated to genuine science also. So we have to bridge
So,
the gap between them.
so just a quick check, what would be the support and what would be the conclusion?
So conclusion is that parapsychology is a genuine scientific enterprise.
Good. And what's the support for this?
Support is that scientific methods such as control experiments and statistical tests of clearly
Right.
stated hypothesis.
So it uses whatever the scientific methods, right? Excellent. Now let's take a look at the options. I'm going to move directly to D. Go ahead, Shwani.
Yeah, so here the answer is not opened, Ajitesh, like it's blurred out. But what D is clearly saying that any field of study that actually uses scientific methods is a genuine scientific enterprise. It bridges the gap that any method which uses a scientific methods is a genuine scientific enterprise.
That is absolutely correct. So just a quick check. Is option D visible to you guys on your screen?
No.
Okay. Is option D visible now? Okay, excellent. Also, I have written something at the bottom. Do you guys see something written over there? Okay, so I've got a few confirmations on this. Excellent. So this is exactly as Shohini pointed out. So parapsychology is, it uses scientific methods, and therefore parapsychology is a genuine scientific enterprise. Option D tells us that anything that employs scientific methods is a genuine scientific enterprise. So now we've got that link between parapsychology and genuine scientific enterprise that we needed for the conclusion. Excellent. Now, I'd be happy to take any other options that you guys may have, but from my side, I wanted to ask why C is not correct. C is, I think, the most commonly marked incorrect option for this question. Whenever you're ready, please let me know.
So I'll take a shot if that's okay.
Of course.
So C option says that any enterprise that does not use controlled experiments and statistical tests is not genuine science.
Mhm.
But I mean, we have to use scientific methods, right? So scientific methods might contain other things which are not controlled experiments and statistical tests. And I mean, that's how I eliminated option C. So because it does not explicitly say that scientific method is not involved. So if it has said something like that scientific method is not involved and is not a, then it is not a genuine science, then I might have chosen option C.
Right. So we'll want to be slightly careful about that. So what you've said, let's divide it into two parts. The first part of what you said is absolutely spot on. If we go back to the argument, it said something like scientific methods such as, controlled experiments and statistical tests. So controlled experiments and statistical tests were just examples of scientific methods. So why does the argument need to assume anything about these two specific examples of scientific methods? So Kush is absolutely right. This argument is about scientific methods. The author is not particularly interested in these two examples of scientific methods. But the second part is, and we need to be very careful about that. If option C, instead of using, these two examples, if it had kind of gone with scientific methods itself, we still would need to be very careful about that. Let me help you see what's happening over here. The conclusion is that parapsychology is a genuine scientific enterprise. And the support for that is parapsychology uses scientific methods. And if we think about the missing link from the support to the conclusion, that missing link is something that uses scientific methods is a genuine scientific enterprise, right? Now, when we say if something uses scientific methods, it is a genuine scientific enterprise, what we're basically saying is scientific methods is a subset of genuine scientific enterprise. And when I say subset, what I mean is it is one way to make something a genuine scientific enterprise. Now, just note that over here, we're not saying that the only way to make something a genuine scientific enterprise is scientific methods, right? So now, again, take a look at the assumption, the missing link. If something uses scientific methods, it is a genuine scientific enterprise. Now, think about that term that we used some time back, the contrapositive. We can say that if something is not a genuine scientific enterprise, then we definitely know that it did not use scientific methods, right? We can be sure about that. But here's the thing, that's not what option C is doing. Option C is actually denying the antecedent. What it's saying is, if SM is not true, then genuine scientific enterprise is not true. And this is now a whole different matter. Now we'll be left asking ourselves, okay, am I really interested in what makes something not a genuine scientific enterprise? So yeah, just to quickly summarize, the point about option C, using just the examples, that's absolutely spot on, well done. But just be careful, even if option C had gone to scientific methods instead of these two examples, we still would not want to look at option C as the missing link. So let's quickly summarize. The existing support is parapsychology, uses scientific methods. And if we had gone with option C, we would have gotten something like this. Something that is not using scientific methods is not genuine science, and therefore parapsychology is genuine science. That's why option C, even a different version of option C, would not have been the right answer. I'm not sure I've explained that properly, but quick check. Is everyone comfortable with why C is out? Perfect.
So,
I've got some. Yeah, go ahead.
So, Ajitesh, just to be clear that we are on the same page, what I've understood is that because option C does not talk about what constitutes a genuine science, it is not going to help us reach to the conclusion, right?
That's right, yes.
Yes.
All right, guys, now we're ready to move on to the next category. This category is called the removal of alternatives. Now, it is important, right? When you look at a situation and you've got a cause or an explanation or a result, it's important to remove the alternative causes, explanations, results. Now, it's very easy to see with an example. Let me put that up over here and let's read it together. At about the same time that publicity about the negative health effects of caffeine increased, coffee consumption decreased. Therefore, the increase in publicity led to the decrease in coffee consumption. Now, when you look at this argument, right, this seems like a classic case of correlation, right? So, correlation being used to get to a conclusion about causation. Two things are happening at about the same time. That's what they're saying. Approximately the same time, there are two things happening. And therefore, they are saying one of them caused the other. So, the structure of the argument is pretty straightforward. When we say we want to remove alternatives, right, what we're basically trying to say is we must assume that nothing other than X was the actual reason for Y. If we are trying to say that X was the reason for Y, then we must assume that nothing other than X was the reason for Y. Quick check, does that sound correct? Okay, I've got a few yeses on this. Let me expand on this. So, if somebody says that X is the reason for Y, right? And you come back to them and say that something other than X was the actual reason for Y, then what happens to your conclusion that X was the reason for Y? Yeah, as Karthik says, it weakens, right? So, right. So, Shreya is also saying it weakens. So, remember, an assumption needs to be a strengthen. So, what you're doing is you're saying, oh, if there is an alternative, then I'm going to remove it. Because the alternative, right, it weakens. So, if you remove the alternative, it actually ends up helping your argument. That's how I want you to look at this. So, removal of alternatives basically means you're taking something that could weaken and you are taking it out of the picture, right? You're removing it. So you're saying that nothing other than X was the actual reason for Y. Now, that is something that I like to call the general form. The specific form would be like this: A was not the actual reason for Y. B was not the actual reason for Y. C was not the actual reason for Y. D was not the actual reason for Y, and so on. So even one example of something, right? So instead of saying nothing other than X, what you can say is something specific like A or B or C was not the actual reason for Y. And this is also important, right? Because again, if you say that A was the actual reason for Y, again, it totally destroys the conclusion. Let's take an example of this. An increase in coffee prices was not the actual reason for the decrease in coffee consumption. Take your time. Let me know. What do you think about this? Is this important for our conclusion or not important? Okay, Karthik is confirming yes, important. Remember, you could try negating the statement and seeing the effect it has on the conclusion. Shoini is also saying that it's important. Once, remember, you can unmute as well if you have a question. Kush is also confirming. Shashank and Shreya have confirmed, and Vansh is also confirmed. Excellent. Now, from our previous sessions, you guys might remember reverse causation, right? Let's see how that plays into assumption questions. Basically, what we want to do is we want to eliminate the possibility of reverse causation. Again, this is sort of like removing an alternative, sort of like that. Basically, you're taking something away that could hurt your argument. Now, let's say that X leads to Y, right? Or that X causes Y. Now, that can't be true if Y causes X, right? That's basic reverse causation. That's what we discussed in our earlier classes. If Y actually causes X, that is terrible for the conclusion that X leads to Y, right? So what you want to do is you want to take this possibility away. You want to eliminate the possibility of the reverse causation. Let's take an example of that. The decrease in coffee consumption was not what led to the increase in publicity. Now, let's understand why this is important. The argument just told us that the increase in publicity and the decrease in coffee consumption happened at around the same time, and therefore they are saying the publicity was the reason for the decrease in consumption. But it is also possible that these two things happened at around the same time. Maybe coffee consumption went down and your newspapers and your TV people, right? They saw this and then they started talking about all the bad effects of coffee. So when coffee sales dropped or coffee consumption dropped, they took note of this and said, "Oh yeah, coffee is bad for you." So if the publicity increase was caused by the decrease in coffee consumption, then the original conclusion is severely weakened. I mean, it is destroyed. So what we want to do is we want to take that possibility away. We want to say the decrease in coffee consumption was not, remember, not what led to the increase in publicity. Quick check, is everyone comfortable with this? Okay, I've got a few yeses. Let me have a quick check with Shreya, Shohini, and Vansh. Vansh is confirmed. Shohini and Shreya, perfect. Kush, is this okay? Excellent. And that brings us to the final pattern. It's something that I like to call affirmation. Affirmation is very straightforward. And for that reason, I think that is why it is also very, very rare. You don't often see questions on affirmation. But let's go through it. When we say that X and Y are connected in some way, right? They're related in some way. Affirmation just means we assert that the path from X to Y is possible. That's all we're doing. We're not doing anything more than that. We're just saying the path from X to Y is possible. Now, to help you understand this, let's take an example of what an affirmation option would look like. Now, this is the same example that we looked at just a few minutes ago, right? At about the same time that publicity about the negative health effects of caffeine increased, coffee consumption decreased. Therefore, the increase in publicity led to the decrease in coffee consumption. Same thing. An affirmation option for this, for an assumption question, would look something like this. It's actually possible for publicity to affect consumption habits. How many of you think this is too easy, as in it's too straightforward to be the answer? Shoini thinks it's a little too simple. Kush is also agreeing, and Karthik is also agreeing. Right. Now, just try taking the opposite of the statement. Like, what happens if it's not possible for publicity to affect consumption? Like, publicity cannot affect consumption. People's consumption habits don't get affected by publicity. What happens, right? Right. So Kush is saying it demolishes the argument. Karthik is saying the conclusion falls apart. Absolutely. So even though this looks very straightforward, looks very simple, it is still quite important, right? And that makes it an assumption option. Let's keep this one also in mind, although it's very rare, right? So we just keep it in mind. It's relatively straightforward. Awesome. Now we're ready to move on to our practice questions. We've got 4 questions ahead of us. Here's the first one of those. Please go ahead. All right, guys, that's time. Please check your answers. The correct answer is E for echo, the last option. Quick check. Did that make sense? Like E, did it look good as the correct option? Okay, I've got a few yeses on this. Perfect. Now let's go through the question. Basically, the setup in this question is that many people, they have a reaction to certain sulfites, right? And what these guys are saying is these winemakers are not going to add any sulfites, so they are not going to add any sulfites. And therefore, those people who would get those reactions, they can drink these wines without getting a reaction to sulfites. That last part is important. Reaction to sulfites. This is important. And why is it important? Because of what the question asks us. The question says, which of the following is an assumption on which the argument depends? Now, when they say that the argument depends, or the argument requires, or the argument relies on, or the conclusion follows only if, which of the following, right? Only if, what they're basically saying is we need something that is necessary for the argument. It just has to be there. And in a lot of cases, if you find something that's like super broad, right, you don't want that kind of an option for a necessary assumption. For example, in this case, if we were to say that these guys, they have removed the possibility of everything that could cause a reaction, including sulfites, but everything else also, that's not necessary because the conclusion just says that those people will not get a reaction to sulfites. And that's all we need to look for. So let's take a look at some of these options. These winemakers have been able to duplicate the preservative effect produced by adding sulfides by means that blah, blah, blah. Don't involve adding any such thing. Okay, so the conclusion doesn't get into other reactions, right? So we also don't need to get into other reactions. Now, this is one of the main options that I wanted to discuss, along with option D, because they're very similar. So I just want to do a quick check over here. Are we okay with why A is out? Okay, I've got, I think, 3 yeses on this. And the next one says, not all forms of sulfite are equally likely to produce the reaction. Now, because this is a necessary assumption question, we can try to negate this and say that, all forms of sulfite are equally likely to produce the reaction. Fine. The conclusions doesn't fall, right? It doesn't fall apart if you negate option B. So this is not necessary for the argument. The argument doesn't need, there to be a difference. Now, wine is the only beverage. Again, even if it's not the only beverage, we should be fine. Option D is very similar to option A. Apart from sulfites, there are no substances commonly present in wine that give rise to an allergic reaction. Are we okay with why we don't need to be concerned about anything else? Because the conclusion is specifically about reactions to sulfites. Let me have a quick yes on this. Okay, I've got 4 yeses. Shohini, is this okay? Perfect. Shashank, is this fine? Yes, excellent. And now let's take a look at the correct answer. Sulfites are not naturally present in the wines produced by these winemakers in amounts large enough to create that kind of reaction. Right. So if you try to negate this and say that the sulfites are naturally there, then what's going to happen? Whether you add the sulfites or not, it won't make a difference. Those people will not be safe from sulfite reactions. So this option is very, very important for the conclusion. This is in fact the correct option over here. Awesome. All right, let's move on to the next one. This question is something that I'd like you guys to take from top to bottom, including all 5 options. Again, you have 2.5 minutes to go through this. Please go ahead. Okay, so we've got another question that seems to be about allergic reactions. Seems the GMAT does like asking us about these things. First of all, please check your answers. The correct answer is C for Charlie, the third option. When you're ready, please unmute and walk me through the whole thing, please.
So the passage says that exposure to certain chemicals commonly used in elementary schools as cleaners or pesticides causes allergic reactions in some children. So this is a premise. Elementary school nurses in Wenston report that the proportion of school children sent to them for the treatment has increased significantly over the past 10 years. Okay, this is also a premise. This is a fact that the passage gives to us.
Mhm.
The last part, therefore, either Wenston school children have been exposed to greater quantities of the chemicals or they are more sensitive to them than school children were 10 years ago. So, this is our conclusion. Uh, the last
Right.
part, everything that succeeds after therefore. Yeah, so the first, option A. So the question is asking us which is the following assumption on which the argument um, depends upon. So basically, we need to
Mhm.
find an assumption that supports that either the quantities of the chemicals that the school children have been exposed to has increased, or that they have been more sensitive to them. Right.
Right. But we'll also like add another word over there. We'll say that this particular option is necessary in order for us to get to that conclusion.
Correct. Yeah. We need to find the necessary option for that.
Perfect.
Yeah. So the first one says that the number of school nurses employed by Renston's elementary school has not decreased over the past 10 years. This has nothing to do with the conclusion. As such, the number of school nurses is not what the
And
conclusion talk about.
I'd like to get into that. Why is this not necessary?
Because because the number of um, school nurses don't have a direct, what do you say, a proportionality effect on the, uh, whether the school children have been exposed to greater chemicals or if the school children are sensitive. So basically, this entire conclusion is about the children themselves. It's not about nurses as such. So either increasing the number of nurses or decreasing them should have no effect because the it's about the school children. So the number of
Perfect.
nurses is not proportional to that. Yeah.
Perfect. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go back and just quickly see how what you said is there in the stimulus, right? So match that up with what's there in the stimulus. So the stimulus says school nurses in Renston report that the proportion of school children sent to them, right? So when we say the proportion of school children sent to them, that literally means the number of children with that particular condition or that reaction, so that allergic reaction, divided by the total number of school children, right? So the proportion of school children, as Shashank mentioned, has nothing to do with the number of nurses. So you may have 10 nurses, you may have a million nurses. It doesn't make a difference to the proportion of children who were sent to nurses. Now, this is a very important point. And Karthik, I see that you raised your hand. Please go ahead, Karthik.
Yes, so Ajitesh, this is what I wanted to discuss because I thought if the number of nurses has decreased, so that simply means that probably a single nurse in the school is now encountering multiple students with the allergies, and hence the reason can be this. So that is the reason I went with A. But now it's clear to me that it's talking about the total number of school children rather than a number of school children going to a particular nurse.
Right. So this is a very important point, and I think you've got it right. Now let's spend a minute to be absolutely sure that we are not looking at reporting at an individual nurse level, right? Let's be absolutely sure about that. Let's read this part again. School nurses in Renston report that the proportion of school children sent to them, right? Now, if you were a single nurse, right, if you were reporting this at a single nurse level, would you ever say the proportion of school children sent to me? right? The proportion
Right.
of, right? So this would not apply at a single nurse level because the proportion of school children is like all children with that reaction divided by the total number of school children. So it would make absolutely no sense to say that the proportion of school children sent to nurses is being reported at an individual nurse level. And that's why option A is not necessary for this. Awesome. Now,
Yes.
let me just do a quick check with the others because this is one of the most commonly marked incorrect options in this question. Let me get a check from the others as well. Are we comfortable with why A is out? Okay, Shohini, Shreya, and one chef confirmed. Kush? Perfect. Now, Shashank, would you like to go ahead with option B?
Yeah. Sure. So option B says children who are allergic to the chemicals are no more likely than other children to have allergies to other substances. This is again about the conclusion is about the exposure of children. It doesn't talk about whether the children are being exposed to other chemicals or different allergies. It's about this one group of chemicals, and they just want to know if the quantity of children being exposed to this has, sorry, the children have been exposed to greater quantities of chemical. So we're comparing the quantities of the chemical, not the likelihood of uh, children being affected by different chemicals. So that's why I eliminated option B.
So let me give you a bit of feedback on that. See, in these necessary assumption questions, right, the correct option may mention something which was not mentioned in the stimulus. So when we look at an option and we say that, oh, the question's not talking about this, right, we need to be very clear about what we are trying to do over there. So are we saying that just because it's not been mentioned, we're going to remove this? Or are we saying that this is not something that the argument needs? In other words, even if these children are more likely than other children to have these reactions to other substances as well, does that hurt the conclusion? That's what we should ask ourselves,
Got it.
right? So even if these kids are more likely to have those reactions to other substances, the conclusion still stands, right? So it doesn't fall apart just because of this particular point or negating this particular point. Quick check. Let's move on to C.
Okay. C states that children who have allergic reactions to the chemicals are not more likely to be sent to a school nurse now than they were 10 years ago.
Mhm.
Yeah. So this does affect the conclusion. So this is basically telling us that if what do you say? Like you mentioned the proportion, right? Like when you said we
Mhm.
have the ratio of the number of total student. I mean, sorry, the number of students who have been showing allergic reactions by the total number of students in the school, right? So this affects that ratio. So, for example, if you imagine that the likelihood uh, varies, right? Or they're saying that they are not more likely. That means if you negate this, children who have allergic reactions to chemicals are more likely to be sent to a school nurse now than they were 10 years ago. This sort of what do you say? It inflates the numerator, right? If you take the
Perfect.
proportion of total infected students by the total students, if they are more likely, your numerator gets inflated now, right? So that sort of affects the conclusion.
Perfect. Now let's just zoom out a bit over here. The conclusion of this argument is basically two things, right? It's basically saying that the reason is either X or Y. If I remember correctly, X was more exposure, and Y was that the kids have become more sensitive. Am I correct? Just give me a quick yes if I remember this correctly. So greater exposure or the kids have become more sensitive. Okay, I've got a few yeses on this. Perfect. So broadly, what they're trying to say is the reason is either X or Y. Now, in that case, if there is, oh, sorry, let's call this Y, right? in that case, if there is a third reason, Z, right, we need to take that third reason out. Because if that third reason is actually a reason, then this is not true anymore. So if they're trying to say that X is the reason or Y is the reason and that's it, there is no other possibility, then you must take out the possibility of Z, like anything else. And as Shashank pointed out, if these kids are more likely to be sent to a school nurse now than they were 10 years ago, what could be happening is the kids are not getting exposed to greater quantities of the chemicals. They are not more sensitive, but they are just more likely to be sent. Like maybe 10 years ago, nobody really cared what happened to the kids. But now, if you don't care what happens to the kids, you get into a lawsuit, right? So now you're like super careful with the children. So earlier, maybe you sent only 20% of the kids who had these reactions, but now you send 100% of the kids who have these reactions. That could be a possibility, right? So maybe it's just the reporting rate that has become better. And what's good about this assumption is you have this comparison with 10 years ago and something has changed. What would that do? If that has changed, it would weaken the conclusion. So what do? We say that the reporting rate has not changed. The reporting rate is the same. And therefore, X or Y, that's the conclusion, is more likely to be true. Quick check. Is everyone comfortable with what Shashank said about option C? Let me have a quick yes or unmute and ask your doubts. Okay, I've received multiple yeses on this. Excellent. Okay, now we come to another option that a lot of people mark. Who would like to take this one? Why is D not correct? D for Delta.
So, Ajitesh, here we are talking about the exposure in the school,
Mhm.
not outside the school.
That's a very good point, but let me confirm. Where are we talking about this exposure? Are you looking at the stimulus or the option?
Yes, stimulus. So, when we
Okay, so
say
in
that,
that case, yeah, go ahead.
so it says that exposure to certain chemicals commonly used in elementary schools causes allergic reactions.
Okay, now let's unpack this. Exposure to certain chemicals commonly used in elementary schools. Does that mean that these chemicals cannot be used elsewhere or they are not used elsewhere?
They can be.
They can be, right? Now look at the conclusion. Therefore, either Renston school children have been exposed to greater quantities of the chemicals. Now look at the way they've worded this. They've said the school children have been exposed to greater quantities. But just
Yes.
because they've used the word school children, does that mean that they were exposed to the quantities of chemicals, greater quantities, in school?
No.
Right. And this is very important to pick up when we get to option D. Now, if the conclusion had said that the school children were exposed to greater quantities of the chemicals in school, then it would be important to assume that the exposure did not happen outside school, some other place. But
Yes.
as such, exactly. So this is not what the conclusion is saying. So this is not needed for the conclusion. Now, there's one more thing that I want you guys to look at. Option D doesn't have like a change in the comparison. I mean, there is no comparison. So, option D, right, to have a comparison, what would you say? Now, imagine that option D had said something like 10 years ago, the chemicals were not used in offices and apartment buildings. And now, 10 years later, they are extensively used. So, that new option D would basically be a comparison and it would show you a change between 10 years ago and now. So, 10 years ago, they were not used outside. Now, 10 years later, they are used outside. That means now. So, there is a change. But in option D, there is no change. It's basically a constant. It's saying that the chemicals are not commonly used as cleaners or pesticides in houses and apartment buildings in Princeton. So that's it. 10 years ago, that was the same thing. Now it's the same thing. So there is no change. There's no comparison for us over here. And therefore, because there's no change over this time period and there's no time period mentioned, this is not a very good option. Even if the conclusion did say that the exposure happened in schools. Now, I explained this very quickly, so I do need to check. Are we comfortable with why D is out? Okay, I've got 3 yeses. Shreya, Vansh, and Shashank. Quick check. Shreya's confirmed. Vansh and Shashank have also confirmed. Perfect. All right, now let's move to the last option. Children attending elementary school do not make up a larger proportion of Renston's population now than they did 10 years ago. Now, this seems to be giving us a comparison, and it seems to be saying, yeah, something has remained stable. Why is this not correct?
Because this affects the denominator, right? So when you have a proportion, this is telling you that the if they don't make a larger proportion of residents' population, so this is sort of leading to the it's a faulty assumption rather. So what we are interested is in how um, if there's a change in numerator, right? Number of students who are infected and that number, if it's increased or not compared to 10 years ago. What he says is if the he basically tells us that the denominator has not increased, rather the denominator is a constant as such. That is the total
So
elementary
hold
school.
on. Yeah, Shashank, we'll have to be careful here. E is not about the denominator. Okay, first of all, let's see what the question is saying. The question said what? The proportion of school children sent to nurses has gone up, right? So when you say the proportion of school children, you mean like all school children, right? So
Correct. Yeah.
let's say that went up from 20% to 50%. Now, these are just my own numbers, right? The question hasn't given us any numbers. These are just my own numbers. So let's say the proportion went up from like 20% to 50%, right? There is an increase. Now,
Yeah.
as you pointed out, the proportion of school children sent to nurses would literally be the number of school children sent to nurses divided by the total number of school children. Option
Correct.
E is just saying children attending elementary school do not make up a larger proportion of Renston's population. So, if this is the entire population, earlier maybe school children were like 25%. Now they are not more than that. So they're either 25 or less than 25%.
Hmm.
Right? So whether they make up a larger, smaller, same proportion of the entire population, right? How does that affect the proportion of school children sent to nurses? That's what you need to quickly check.
Correct. Yeah.
Sure, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Excellent. So basically, what that means is this is not an assumption that the argument needs. So the argument doesn't need school children to have become a smaller, larger, or same proportion of the entire population. That's not needed by the argument. All the argument needs is the proportion of school children sent to nurses to go up. It doesn't need an additional assumption about what proportion of the population they form. Quick check. Is everyone comfortable with this? Let me have a yes or a no in the chat window. Okay, I've got multiple yeses on this. Shohini, this one's okay? Perfect. All right, guys. Second last question. Please go ahead. All right, that's time. The correct answer over here is D. D for Delta, the fourth option. Now, let's go through the stimulus. They basically found that with low levels of immune system activity, you get a lower score on mental health than people with normal or high immune system activity. So let's put that down. Normal or high, basically, it leads to a higher score on tests of mental health than people with low immune system activity. So I think that's pretty straightforward. And this seems to be another, correlation sort of situation that they've got going on over here. In this question, if I remember correctly, the options that most people have trouble removing, what are those? Probably A and B, if I remember correctly. We'll go through all the five options, of course. Now, I just want to get a quick idea. Can anybody help me see why the correct answer is correct? So that's D. And after that, we'll move back to some of these other options.
Yes, so Ajitesh here, it reverses the causation. So it says that it
Yes.
is not. Yeah.
Yeah, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
So it says that it is not the immune system that leads to mental illness or physical disease, but the mental illness might also be the cause for the immune system activity to decrease. So it reverses the causation.
That is absolutely correct. Now, because he's given the right reason, I think what I can add over there is an example, right? So, my favorite example for this question is stress. Okay, so let's keep that on one side. Now, in this question, what they're basically telling you is people with high or normal immune system activity, they get higher scores on tests of mental health than people with low immune system activity. Now, one of the things in this question that we have to ignore is this part. Towards the end, they will say that the immune system protects you against mental as well as physical something, something. Right? So, that physical part, we need to kind of ignore for that for this particular question. So we need to ignore that part for this particular question. Now, we can come back to this, right? But the logic of this argument is not about proving that, yes, the immune system can protect you against physical disease. The logic of this argument is, or the purpose of this argument is to help you understand that the immune system activity can protect you against mental illnesses as well. So that's the main thing, the mental part of it. Keep that in mind. The physical part is not that important. The logic is set up to address the mental part. Now, if it is true, so I mean, they are trying to say that your immune system protects you against mental as well. But let's take an example of what Karthik said. And as I said, my favorite example is stress. Have you guys noticed that sometimes when you're under a lot of stress, right? Maybe it's a work related thing, maybe it's a personal thing, but some kind of like intense stress, sometimes you become more likely to get ill, right? Has anybody noticed this? Let me have a yes or a no. Like when there is a lot of stress, right? Now, yeah, so a lot of you have also noticed this. Now, I'm not a doctor. I don't know whether this actually happens or not. But the point I'm trying to make is when somebody is under a lot of stress, it may be true that their immune system activity gets compromised. Exactly, headaches, right? So you often get these migraine type headaches if you're under a lot of stress. So the point is, maybe it is the stress that has reduced your immune system activity. So your immune system is not protecting you against mental illnesses. It is your mental state that is affecting your immune system. So the causation flows in the other direction. So what do we have to do in this sort of situation? We have to say that the reverse causation is not true, right? We have to take that out. Mental illness does not cause people's immune system activity to decrease. Quick check, is everyone comfortable with why D is correct? So Karthik's explanation and the example that we took, let me have a yes or a no. Okay, perfect. Now, let me just refresh my memory because I just want to check which options I really wanted to discuss. E, no, E is not that common. Mm, yeah, I mean, C, B, and A. Yeah, let's take A, B, and C. Whenever you're ready, pick one of these options and tell me why it's wrong. Any one of these options, A, B, C.
Hi, Ajitesh.
Go ahead, Shoni.
Yes, so here this option A is actually basically differentiating between high immune system and normal immune system,
Mhm.
right? But in the question, they are not discriminating that. So they are basically saying that low levels of immune system and comparing it with normal and high. So that's why it was irrelevant.
Very good. So for this argument, right, this argument, as Shoni pointed out, is going to look at a difference between low and normal high. So normal and high are in one category. It does not need to further differentiate between normal and high. Good job. So remember, even if you think that A can help you, that's not what we need. What we need is, does the argument need it? Right? The argument doesn't need that further differentiation. Okay. Now, who would like to take option 17%? Oh, you mean on GMAT Club? Okay, so let's come to B. Mental illness is similar to physical disease in its effects on body systems. How do we take this out? What do you guys think?
So the argument does not talk about any effects on the body systems, right? So I just thought that's irrelevant.
That is correct. But rather than saying that the argument doesn't talk about it, what we'll say is the argument doesn't need the effect to be the same. So let's say your physical illness is of a particular type and your mental illnesses are of a different type, right? Let's say like headaches or something. Do we need both your physical illness, like a fever, and a mental illness, like a headache or something, to be the same type, like to have the same effect on body systems? That's what we need to ask ourselves. Even if the effects are different, right? But you notice that people with better immune systems, right, have lower problems in terms of mental diseases or whatever the stimulus was talking about. The argument is still perfectly fine. So the argument stands. Quick check, is everyone okay with why B is out?
Ajitesh, I was thinking,
Mhm.
why would I, as a test taker, would mark option B? So if we go to the stimulus, we'll see that nowhere in the stimulus does it mention the physical disease except in the last line of the stimulus. So, probably it is what makes somebody choose B, because it then says that because we are inferring the conclusion from the stimulus and nowhere it mentions physical disease. So that is why one would mark B.
That is very insightful. That is, in my experience, the number one reason why people, and maybe not just number one, maybe it is the only reason that people mark option B. So that is
Okay.
very insightful. And that is why at the beginning we said that in this particular argument, the logic of the argument is set up to help you connect the immune system to the mental issues, not to the physical. The physical is just taken as an assumption and it's never dealt with again. So, this entire argument is like saying, oh, yeah, everyone knows the immune system activity protects you against physical disease. But take a look at these scores of mental health and immune system activity. And therefore, the immune system protects you against mental issues as well, mental illness. Right? So that's how this particular argument is set up. So a lot of people struggle with this. They feel that, oh no, this argument is trying to convince me that it does it for physical and mental illness. That's not the case. Even though it says it, the entire logic of this argument is built around convincing us that the immune system protects against mental illness. It's not really about the physical side of it. The physical side is just taken for granted. Quick check, is everyone comfortable with this, what we just discussed? And then we'll move on to C. Okay, I've got multiple yeses. Perfect. All right. I think you guys have given me the right reasons for 3 options till now: D, A, and B. How about one more? Option C. Why not C? Why is C not required or necessary? Why does the argument not depend on this?
So, Ajitesh, I think here again they are focusing only on the high immune system.
Mhm.
So, in the question, it's normal and high both are has been taken as a positive, and low immune system is the only one which is affecting the mental illness.
When you say it's the only one affecting, how much of an effect do you think we're seeing? Or is the argument even clarifying that? Is it specifying it?
No, they are not.
Yeah, this is the important part. They're not specifying it. Now, if you go back to the stimulus, all they're saying is people who have low levels tend to score much lower than people with normal or high. So when we say people with low levels tend to score much lower, Does that mean people with normal or high have perfect scores, that they're perfectly protected in some way? And remember the word tend also. Tend means
Hmm.
generally, right? Generally does not mean always. Generally means generally. So tend means they generally tend to score much lower. And score much lower does not mean that the other score is like perfect or 100%, right? So this argument doesn't need the people with high immune system activity to be completely immune from mental illness. It just needs them to be better at it than people with lower scores on that mental health test. Awesome. Quick check. Let me have a yes on this before we move on to the last question. Excellent. All right, guys. Time for the final question now. Please go ahead. All right, that's time. Please check your answers. The correct answer is E. E for echo, the last option. Now, in this particular question, I think the only option that I want to check is option E. We can discuss any options that you guys want to take. But from my side, the question is why is E correct?
So basically, here it actually helps with this one if we go with a negation test also in this case, that
Mhm.
potential depositors are able to determine which banks are secure against failure. So if the depositors are not able to figure out that the which banks are good and which banks are not secure against failure, then they will not be able to select that which bank they want to deposit. So here the economists' confidence on this argument, the confidence on the economist arguments goes down in that case.
Very good. So if we were to summarize the argument in a, like put in a nutshell, it basically comes down to having some sort of faith in the depositor's ability to be selective. So they're saying if depositors were more selective, then banks would need to be secure, right? But are depositors capable of being selective? I mean, maybe they just don't have enough information or experience to take that sort of a decision, right? So that's what E addresses. Now, some of these other options, bank failures are caused when big borrowers default on loan repayments. Significant proportion of depositors maintain accounts at several different banks. A lot of these options, they really are not needed by the author over here. Option E, which says potential depositors are able to determine which banks are secure against failure. As Shohini pointed out, this is the only option that is necessary for the conclusion. Because if you're putting all your hopes on the depositors, then the depositors should be able to execute on whatever you want them to do, right? So, as she pointed out, if potential depositors are not able to determine which banks are secure against failure, then how are they going to be more selective, right? How will then banks will not have to do anything because the depositors are not capable of being more selective. So E is extremely important over here. Quick check. I think we went through this question very quickly, but let me know any doubts with the correct option, any other options that you'd like to discuss. Please go ahead. Or if it's okay, then put a yes. I think Kush is confirming no doubts. Shohani saying no doubts. Karthik is saying yes. Shreya and Shashank. Shreya is also saying yes. And Shashank, quick check. Shashank is also confirmed. Okay, excellent. That brings us to the end of this session. Now, just before we break for the day, quick look at where we are. We've covered the major question types now, right? Now, some of the less commonly tested question types are still left. We plan to do conclusion next, and after that, we will do maybe paradox. So conclusion, of course, includes inference, but after that, we'll do paradox and evaluate, probably in the same session because those questions are not very common. For today, thank you all so much for attending this session. I hope you have a great day. I will see you guys in the next session. Please go ahead, enjoy the rest of your Sunday. You're welcome, Kush. You're welcome, Shreya. You're welcome, Karthik. And Shohini, you're welcome.
Thank
Have a
you.
good day. Is that Shashank? You're welcome, Shashank. Have a great day.